So I'm from St. Louis, and I like to say that by day I'm a journalist, a data journalist at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch newspaper, and by night I'm an amateur computer historian. And I publish my retro computing work on my website, Break In a Chat, and it started kind of two parts to it. There's a blog and a wiki, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But like I said, I grew up with Atari. So here I am in middle school using my Atari 520 ST, and I love two things, Atari and bulletin board systems. Here I am a few years later. Now I'm on a 1040 STE, still BBSing, and my dad's trying to get some work done in the back. And when I say that I loved Atari, like, we really loved Atari. We loved Atari so much that my parents went out of their way to go hunt down a Jaguar the year of its release and get it for us for Christmas. And it was only available in 2 test markets in 1993. And I still have that Jaguar today and still play it. And part of this story that I won't really be able to get into is that I had to unload my Atari ST stuff at a certain point also. And that kind of hampered me when I was trying to recover some of the software. So I have since reacquired a Mega STE, and so that's kind of my main retro computer that I use at home. But if you're not familiar with my website, like I said before, 2 parts. There's a blog and a wiki. The wiki is where the whole genesis of it was that Wikipedia was deleting articles about BBS games. A bunch of games that I thought were kind of notable that they decided weren't notable, and they started deleting them. So I forked all those articles onto my own wiki. I've been adding to it since then, but really the blog is the main part of the website, and that's where I'm publishing all my original research. So I've been interviewing the creators of BBS door games. Right now I'm in the middle of publishing a 6-part series that's been years of research into something called instant graphics and sound. And it was a vector graphics language for Atari ST BBSs in the late 80s, early 1990s. Something kind of like RipScript, if you've ever heard of RipScript, but like 4 years before RipScript. So as a way you could actually have vector graphics, music, and animation on a bulletin board system exclusively for the Atari ST. And it's most people have never heard of it. And so that's kind of what I try to specialize in, things that most people haven't heard of, and trying to dive deep into those things and you know, kind of share about them. So, and that's what I'm going to do today. I'm going to talk to you about my research looking into the software of Yaakov Kirschen. So here's just a few discs that I got from Kirschen. He lives in Israel, and I've become more of a digital preservationist. Originally I was just kind of writing, but in recent years I've been recovering things from discs, and I've published on my website several either lost or unpublished programs. And the work that I'm going to talk about today, there's about 10 or 12 things, all of them created either in whole or part by Kirschen, and most of it was recovered from discs like these or a couple discs that I had and that another guy had. So I want to get into this. This software has an Atlanta connection, and so I'm going to try to highlight that in this talk today. And I thought maybe a way to get into this would be by talking about games about migration. 2 games I want to compare real quickly. One game you're probably familiar with, and the other one you've probably never seen or heard of. And these are educational games for the Apple II, made in the 1980s, about migration. And so the first one, I think you probably recognize. You were talking about it earlier. Oregon Trail.
What's the record this year? One per year?
Yeah. And this year, the entire family.
Oh wow, okay.
So this is the classic 1985 version of Oregon Trail, and as I'm sure many of you know, that game is actually much older. It was originally a text game, and then kind of they made more graphical versions. This is the classic one that most millennials remember. And millions of students played this game, and it really was an example of how a historical simulation could be both engaging and informative.
Learn about this
Yes, exactly. And there was tragedy in the game, and that is equally true of the other program that I want to show you. Has anyone ever seen this before? This is a screen from a game called the Georgia Variations. It was made by Kirschen and by a group in Israel called Gesher Educational Affiliates. And so, oop, I went back. Let's see here. Come back. So the Georgia Variations was a game that was built specifically to be displayed in 1983 at a special event, special Jewish event, sort of a convention that was being held here in Atlanta. And this game, kind of like, it had similar aims for the Oregon Trail, but it met a very different fate. The Oregon Trail was so popular and so well remembered, you can play it today in a lot of different ways. You can buy it, you can play it in emulation. It's easily available. They even made a physical handheld, because that's how popular it was. But in contrast, the Georgia Variations, very few people got to play it. It wasn't sold or distributed very well, and most people never heard of it, and it was actually lost. There was no archive where you could find this game. Until 2022, when I published it on my website along with like 10 or 11 other related pieces of software. And so what I want to share with you today is kind of what these games were, the history. I've been for years looking into this software and trying to understand the people who made it, why it didn't work, and just some things like that. And so, yes.
You made me get here. What did it run on? So.
What did it run on?
You have machines.
Oh yeah, so there were probably 10 or 12 pieces of software, depending on how you count some of them. The early educational software was for the Apple II, and that was a mix of things that Kirschen worked with Gesher on, and then there were several things he did independently. Then he wrote some of the first software for the Atari ST, and he called it his artificial personalities, but it actually started as something else, which I'll explain later. Then he made some innovative music software for the Commodore Amiga, and this was software that he called artificial creativity, and it was, you might call it an algorithmic composer. It was a way that the computer would make music itself. And then that same technology was later ported to the PC, and it was called the Music Creator. Music Creator was actually released. The Amiga stuff was unreleased. But in all these cases, despite getting splashy coverage in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the London Times, San Francisco Chronicle, and the music software was used in a BBC documentary, despite all of that, all of this stuff was commercially either a failure or was never published. And
how did you find out about it?
So I totally restructured this presentation. Originally, it started with that. Okay. And I'm going to skip over that just in the interest of not trying to take up too much of your time, but there is a whole story about that. Okay. But I had one of his programs, and apparently was one of almost the only people who kept it. Okay. So that was kind of the in. And this is, just wanted to make a point that I'm sure most of you would already agree with, preaching to the choir here, but our digital world is more ephemeral than we realize. And it's just like, it's something that I didn't understand at first, how easy it is for stuff to get lost. The software, the documents, the digital creations, the photos that we have today, they can easily be gone tomorrow, erased by arbitrary corporate decisions, hardware failures, neglect, time, tons of other stuff. But it's so important to save these things for the future. Like, we don't know what's going to be important in the future. And there's an Apple II cracker named 4AM who has been going through all kinds of educational software and cracking it in the last few years. And he said something that I thought was really good. He said, this was how we taught math and science and grammar and history to an entire generation of children. And that seems like something worth saving. And I would add to that, in the context of what I'm going to talk about today, also religion. History and religion was also taught this way. And so even though these games may not necessarily be something people want to play today, they still have value in terms of understanding how they were used back then. So let me go ahead and introduce you to Yaakov Kirschen, who's kind of he's the through line here. At first blush, he might seem to be a very unlikely person to get into software development. For 50 years, his great life's work was Dry Bones, which is a cartoon that was published in the Jerusalem Post, an English language newspaper in Israel. He used it to comment on the absurdities of life in modern Israel. And at the height of dry bones' popularity in the 1980s, Kirschen was pretty well known across the Jewish diaspora. And in fact, Kirschen was so closely associated with this cartoon that most of his people who knew him in Israel call him Dry Bones. They don't call him Kirschen. They call him Bones or Dry Bones. And I've noticed in the research I've been doing this week and some of the letters I was reading of other people, they also call him Dry Bones. And so I think that just kind of speaks of how closely he is connected to his own work. When he decided to become a software developer, he used the clout and the connections that he had built with the success of Dry Bones to open doors in the computer industry. And he actually rubbed shoulders with Jack Tramiel, Irving Gould, Bob Rosenshine, who is the founder of Answers.com, and other people like that. But Yaakov Kirschen wasn't born in Israel, and he had a different name. He was born Gerald Neil Kirschen, and he grew up in Brooklyn, New York. He was born in 1939. His family, he wasn't particularly religious, but later in life, his Jewish identity would become very important to him. In college, Kirschen studied fine art and painting and thought that he might get into something more serious. But after college, he found that he could use his sense of humor in the different jobs that he was getting. And so he was publishing freelance cartoons in magazines like Cracked throughout the 1960s. He also worked at a greeting card company called Norcross, very briefly, when they decided they wanted to get into gag cards. And so they hired a bunch of people like Kirschen who were kind of young hippie-ish guys with a wicked sense of humor. And they didn't fit in and got fired pretty quickly after they hired him on. It was a pretty stodgy place at that time. So how did this cartoonist get into computers? Well, it kind of happened in a roundabout way. In the 50s and 60s, there was a revolution going on called electronic data processing. It was a new technology that was disrupting finance and business. It was a form of automation that let big companies, banks, centralize their record keeping and their payroll, and it let them get rid of clerical workers who had been doing that work in the past. Just a little aside, if you like Star Trek, the original Star Trek, there are several episodes that don't talk about electronic data processing, but they're about automation and about the fears that people had at that time. It was a real, in our culture, there was a lot of fear about what automation meant and where it was going. At the same time, though, they were getting rid of clerical workers, but they needed new workers who understood how to program these EDP machines. And that's kind of where Kirschen came in. He worked for a firm that was called Reinforced Learning. And they developed self-instructional training courses. So they would kind of record these things onto reel-to-reel tape or records, and you would play it back, and it was kind of interactive, and it was a particular technique that they used so that people or classes with just one teacher could learn complicated subjects over time. And so this firm was hired by NCR, National Cash Register, and IBM to develop training courses for EDP systems so that they could train personnel at their customers. So Kirschen was sent to meet with computer scientists at the campuses of NCR and IBM in order to do research for these training courses. So he wasn't really a programmer himself, but he was interviewing the cyberneticists and learning the basics of computers and being introduced to things like game theory or the Turing test. And so it was through that work that he was introduced to computers. But automation was not the only force roiling American society and politics at that time. There was an enormous amount of upheaval. And after the 1968 Democratic National Convention, which Kirschen was a delegate at, he kind of became radicalized, and he became a radical Zionist. And he believed that Jews needed to empower themselves. And he actually decided to take his family and to move to Israel. It's a process that's called aliyah, which is a Hebrew word that means ascent or to go up, like to go up to Mount Zion. And what this refers to is anytime any Jewish person in the world decides that they want to go back to their homeland, to go there to live permanently, And so that's what he decided to do. And it was a pretty radical thing to do, to kind of uproot his family, leave behind comfortable careers in cartooning and in these training courses, and kind of go reinvent himself. So Kirschen and his family moved, 1971, and he imagined that in Israel he'd start a new life with a new name in a new country, and he thought, given his background, he might be able to break into the high-tech sector, which Israel had a high-tech sector and continues to have a very high-tech sector today. But it really didn't work out that way. Instead, after 2 years, he fell back on his first love, cartooning, and he found that actually there was a market for his outsider's perspective on the idiosyncrasies of living in Israel. And so he launched Dry Bones in 1973, and it quickly became a hit. By the end of the 1970s, while Jimmy Carter was mediating peace between Israel and Egypt, Dry Bones kind of became a must-read for politicians and diplomats who cared about the Middle East. And President Carter, as you can see in this image here, actually sent a note to Kirschen responding to one of his cartoons on a topic related to, I think it's a visit from Sadat. The newspaper industry at this time was really at the peak of its power, and Kirschen was drawing a popular cartoon in a small but influential newspaper in a part of the world that demanded attention. And so that leads us to the 1980s. All the computers that we know and love were kind of introduced in the United States in the late 70s, the Apple II, TRS-80, Atari 400, and all those. But that microcomputer revolution that started here took a little bit longer to get to Israel. And so around 1980, Kirschen decides, I want in on this. I can have a computer in my house. And so he wanted to get in on it. So he joined a computer club, probably one just like this. And he did the things that people in computer clubs did in those days, especially trading pirated software, swapping floppies. So he got right into it. But he wasn't the only one who was getting in on computers. There was an organization in Israel called Gesher, excuse me, that wanted to embrace this medium of video games and computer games. Gesher is a name that means bridge, and their mission was to bring together secular and religious Jewish young people. I've been to Israel in the past when I was in college, and I didn't understand before that trip just how fractured Israeli society is. It's not just the division between Jews and Christians and Muslims, but even within those big faiths, there's a ton of differentiation and a lot of people who don't see eye to eye on things. And then you add into the mix the secular Jews who are not religious at all. And so there's a lot of headbutting and people who don't want to listen to each other. And so Gesher was trying to get those young people to talk to each other and to have dialogue. And so they set up a TV and film production studio because they saw that kids were really getting into Big Bird and Pac-Man, and they thought, we could do that. We could make television programming like Big Bird. We could make computer games. And so they set up Jerusalem Productions, which was their TV and film arm, and then they set up a computer center that had a kind of an unwieldy name that they abbreviated JETCET, which I'm pronouncing in my head Jet Set. I'm not sure if that's what they actually called it or not. But so they created these two divisions. The educators on Gesher's computer team had a passion for educating children. Two of the three people that you see pictured here, I'm certain they're ordained rabbis and had backgrounds in teaching. But they didn't have much experience in computers. So they had this passion, but they were kind of learning as they went in terms of how to make games. Their very first effort was a game called Jerusalem Squares that was kind of like Hollywood Squares, and you can actually see it in this photo. But to go back to my earlier point about how ephemeral our digital world is, this software is lost. I have not been able to find any copy of it. The closest that I got was that among Kirshen's discs, there was a Jerusalem Squares disc that had another label on top, and he had overwritten it because, you know, floppies, if you didn't need what was on there, you just overwrote it. And so I've never been able to find or recover any copy of the Jerusalem Squares program. It's lost. But that was their first completed software. I want to point out two key people in this photo. The first one is Nisan Ziskin. He was the boss of the computer team. He was responsible for kind of designing the software and kind of figuring out what they wanted to make. And the other one is David Geffen. David Geffen was the director of information for Gesher. He was sort of a PR publicity guy. He was in charge of letting people know about Gesher's work. And David Geffen is our Atlanta connection. So the Geffens have been in Atlanta since 1910. His grandfather, the Rabbi Tobias Geffen, immigrated to the United States and moved to Atlanta to become the rabbi of the congregation Shearith Israel, which is a famous congregation here in Atlanta. And Tobias Geffen is famous for making a determination on whether or not Coca-Cola was kosher. And apparently got Coca-Cola to make a couple minor tweaks to their recipe so that he could, in good faith, say that it was kosher. And so it's David Geffen's parents and his own family papers that I have been exploring at Emory this past week. Now, just like Kirschen, both Ziskin and Geffen also had made Aliyah to Israel in the 70s. And many of the people associated with the software were the same. They were Americans who made this life-changing choice to go live in Israel.
Are they still alive?
Yes, both of them are still alive. In fact, I corresponded with David Geffen this morning, and I'm going to share something with you that he just this morning gave me permission to share with you. So, yes, they're both still living. Geffen is in his 80s. I'm not exactly sure how old Ziskin is. Kirschen also is in his 80s. And I want to stress this point again about Aliyah because migration is a big theme in the games that they made and the games they were planning to make. And Ziskin I interviewed him a couple years ago, and he told me they were planning a game called Roots and Routes. And it would have been an adventure game through history where the player would kind of face different dilemmas, but have to move his family to different Jewish population centers over time, sort of kind of reenacting the history that generations of Jewish families went through, where they faced persecution and had to move. And so this is the bit that I wanted to share with you. So one of the things that really made an emotional impact on me yesterday was finding the letters that David Geffen wrote to his parents and to his congregation when they made the sudden decision that they wanted to go live in Israel permanently. And just kind of the weight of that decision and the impact that it had. He was a rabbi at that time in 1977 working in Delaware. He had you might say a cushy job, a very solid, secure job where he was making good pay. And he was on a sabbatical with his family in Israel, and they just found that life there was so compelling they had to move. They had to change their life. And these are just two very short excerpts from letters that he wrote to his parents. He wrote, "As the time draws closer for us to leave Israel, it's harder and harder to face our return to Wilmington and to our life there. As you are well aware, we've been in Israel many times, for it has a magnetic power that we can't resist. However, although we enjoyed our visits in the past, we had never actually lived here such a long period of time as a family. And during the past few months, the children have lived Jewishly in a way we never dreamed possible. Our lifestyle, ruled by a Jewish calendar in a Jewish country, has been most meaningful to us." And then later he wrote, "Since we do live in this century in which a Jewish state is a reality, we feel a great desire to be a part of it. We do so because our lives revolve completely around Judaism, and this is the only place in the world where Judaism can revolve around us. Israel needs us, and we need her in a way which we cannot adequately describe since she's become so much a part of us." They wanted to be part of history. Something historical had happened in their lifetimes, and they realized we need to be here and be part of it. Their parents and their congregation were shocked by this decision, and there was a lot of anger and disbelief and a lot of, "You can't do that. You don't have any job. You don't have any prospects. How are you going to provide for your family? You're taking your grandchildren away from us, or taking our grandchildren away from us." And they were moving to a tumultuous country that had just seen 2 wars in a very short period of time. And so when you read these letters, it just gives you a sense of how difficult a decision this must have been for people to make. And yet many of the people making these games had made that same decision. And so this is a screen from one of the games. that happens after you immigrate to Israel. And so it's a theme that they had in some of these games. Now, around this time, the Jewish community here in Atlanta was getting excited because there were two big things happening. 1983 was going to be the 250th anniversary of the state of Georgia. And coinciding with that, there was a big convention, which they called the General Assembly of Jewish Federations, where delegates from all the local Jewish federations around North America would get together. So there's probably like 4,000 people that were coming to this convention. And it was going to be held in Georgia at the same time that they were celebrating this 250th anniversary. So local Jewish leaders here in Atlanta decided we need to do something special to mark this occasion. And they decided we're going to make a 250th exhibit celebrating 250 years of Georgian Jewish history. And they wanted it to be a multimedia exhibit. Now, David Geffen, because of his connection to Atlanta, his parents and his grandparents lived here. He would come back and visit, and he would come and show Gesher's work here in Atlanta and in other cities around the country. So he was aware of these plans for this exhibit. And he visited Atlanta in the summer of 1982 to promote Gesher and to show the computer games to the Jewish groups here. And it seems likely that he suggested to them, you should incorporate computer games into this, and we can help you make some computer games. And, excuse me, and so an arrangement was reached. Gesher would make computer games, including at least one with about the history of Jews in Georgia, for this special exhibit in Atlanta in 1983. But like I mentioned, one of the problems is that the Gesher team kind of lacked experience with graphics and animation. And so at some point in late 1982, it's not clear if they recruited Kirschen or if Kirschen approached them. However it happened, he was brought on board. And Kirschen, even though he had limited computer experience at that time, he did have experience making rudimentary animations of his cartoon in Israel for television news programs. And of course, he had great experience in art direction and in cartooning. Now, you remember how I said that Kirschen liked to swap floppies and trade pirated games? Well, that's how he met this teenage software cracker, Danny Weisberg. Danny Weisberg had created a graphics library that he called Raster Master. And that's what he kind of hooked up with Kirschen, and Kirschen decided to use this graphics library for the Gesher games that they were going to make. And so Danny provided that software, and then he worked again with Kirschen later for one of his later games that I'll show you in a minute. Okay, that was a lot of background. And thank you for sticking with me through that. But I'd like to now actually show you the games. 4 games that were shown in Atlanta that were developed by Gesher under Kirshen's direction. So first we have what Ziskin described to me as Gesher's small games. So their idea was we want to make a few small games we can make quickly. And then they had big ideas for some big games that were going to be much richer in educational content. So these 3 games were going to be based on existing arcade games. The first one was Nosh Kosh. And it was going to be a game like Pac-Man, where the main character is called Chunky. He looked like Pac-Man, except he's wearing a kippah. And he would, instead of eating dots, the whole entire screen is full of hamburgers, ice cream, and carrots. And so the idea is you need to eat everything, but you have to eat it in the right order. And you have to wait the right amount of time between eating the meat and eating the dairy. And so the idea was to teach children about kashrut. And in the meantime, you're being chased by 3 bad guys, and I always get their names wrong. Let's see, Peter Pig, Larry Lobster, and Freddy Frog's Legs. So if any of them touch you, you're also dead. Because they're not kosher, exactly. So let's see if we can make this demo work. Let's see here. Oh, you know what? I'm gonna have to. Okay, it is there. Oh, it's tiny. Okay, I'm gonna do terrible at this. So for this game, the left and right is arrow keys, up and down is A and Z, and the A and Z thing I just have never been able to get the hang of. And I don't know, volume-wise, if it's... You know what? That didn't go well.
It says boy.
Oh. All right, try it one more time. There it goes. I didn't have my caps lock key on. Oh. As you can see, it's really easy to die. I have never completed the first level. But you know what? I have played it enough times to start to realize that this game is really overwhelming visually. The whole screen is full of sprites. And so it's not spare and elegant like Pac-Man is. But there is a design to the level, and there are sort of paths that become clearer to you if you play it. Let me try it one more time and see if I can do any better. I probably won't, but let's see. So the carrots are, I think the carrots are sort of like a path. And then you kind of, there we go. Okay, that's progress. I knew it was going to happen. Okay, let's see here. No, I'm not dead yet. This is the longest I've gone in a long time. Oh, there we go. What I haven't studied yet is what I'm not sure about the AI for the bad guys. I'm not sure that it's probably not like Pac-Man, where there's this variety. Okay, so coming back here, the second game was called Borders. Borders, in the same way that Oshkosh is based on Pac-Man, Borders was kind of loosely based on Donkey Kong. It's a platform game. And as you can see in this screenshot, it's all about traveling through history and avoiding period-specific enemies who were persecutors of the Jewish people. So here you have the Roman Empire, you've got some Roman soldiers down there. You reach Crusader Europe, and there's like knights, Crusader knights that are chasing you. And so I think there's maybe like 6, maybe 7 different platforms. And so the way the game works is you move to the left, you have to jump and touch the Torah. And when you touch the Torah, it unlocks an elevator on the right-hand side. So you have to go back over to the elevator, and then you get lifted up to the next level. What's interesting about this game is that it has an ending. And so I showed you one of the screens for the ending. And in fact, what I'm going to do is I've got the disc that has a demo mode. One of the discs that I obtained has a demo mode. And at first, I wasn't sure how to play this game because it wasn't really obvious what you're supposed to do, that you're supposed to touch the Torah and all that stuff. But there's a demo mode that shows you exactly how to play and how to win. And so I want to try to see if we can. Let's see where.
Are the disc images for these games available on your website?
Yes, all of the disc images for all of these games are available both on Break Into Chat and also on the Internet Archive. And all the Apple II games are actually playable in your browser on the Internet Archive. The later software is hit or miss in terms of some of the Atari ST emulation, for example, on the archive doesn't do sound very well, and I'm having trouble with the PC sound also. But it is all there. Okay, give me just a second. I gotta switch disk images here. Did that work? It did not work. Resets. Where's freeze? Video. Freeze. State. I think it's this one. Okay. And I lost my cursor. Okay, so we're on the last level here. He's going to jump and touch the Torah, and now there's a little white platform that has appeared on the right-hand side. He's going to run over there, and it's going to lift him up. And this was the last level. So the rest of this is kind of like your reward for getting to the end of the game. And here you see that migration is a theme again. He's going to run over and get into a boat, and he is headed to the land of liberty. Yeah, so you can see like a steamship there, and you can see the Statue of Liberty.
Master didn't have full screen scrolling. It didn't go very fast.
No, it didn't. I think that's part of this development is kind of the disconnect because they were so far away in terms of being able to learn all the tricks that everyone else knew here. And look at the things they emphasize here. Video, hamburger heaven, pizza.
Chicago, Atlanta.
And Atlanta, and that's deliberate inclusion there because Atlanta had this Jewish center, but also this game was going to be shown here. But look where he's going now. He's not sticking around anymore in the United States. And so now he's headed to Israel. And so this is the final game screen. And so you've got the Star of David flag, and I guess this is I believe meant to evoke Jerusalem. Okay, so that was Borders. The last game, I'm not going to demo it, but it's called Aleph Baders, and it's based on Space Invaders. And in Space Invaders, you're shooting up at aliens that are coming down. In Aleph Baders, you're poking up with a pointer at Hebrew alphabet letters that are descending down the screen, and you're trying to get them in alphabetical order. So that's Aleph, Bait, kind of like Alpha, Beta. Yes, yes. And there's different fonts, if you will. I think there's like a script version and a non-script version. But yeah, it was intended to help you learn your Hebrew letters. Let's see here. So those were what were called the small games. That's what Ziskin described as the small games. And they also had these big games. Roots and Routes that I described to you earlier, which was a game they planned, never was actually made the way that they originally envisioned it. But instead, some of the research for that game and for some other games was kind of channeled into this game, the Georgia Variations that I showed you earlier. And originally, the Georgia Variations was called the Goldberg Variations. And the reason it had that name is because you play the role of Boris Goldberg, a Jewish boy in Eastern Europe in the 19th century. But they changed the title for the exhibit, and they added Georgia content. So this is a screen from near the end, where after you've arrived in America, you basically ride on a train down to Georgia. And there's a whole sequence where you get to learn some facts about the Jewish community in Georgia and about the history of the Jewish community here. In this game, the player makes choices which affect the storyline. But kind of in the end, all the threads eventually lead to this same ending of going to Georgia. And you might call this like a choose-your-own-adventure game, or a more formal description would be like a choice-based narrative. So you get chunks of text and then 2 or 3 choices. You choose those, and then you see what happens. Now, unlike the previous 3 games, this one was entirely original, based on historical images and research that was gathered by David Geffen that I showed you earlier, who's from Atlanta. And one thing that I learned in my research this week as a realization was that some aspects of this game are clearly derived from David Geffen's own personal history. So his grandfather, Tobias Geffen, the one who immigrated here and became a rabbi, he was born in Kovno, Lithuania, which is a city that is in this game. In fact, the whole game is set in Lithuania, although it doesn't say that, but it is. And in addition to that, in this, one of the things that prompted Geffen to leave was pogroms that were happening in Russia at that time. So about a month after a famous one occurred, he decided we're leaving. And he brought his family to America to avoid what did come later. And so in this game, in the Georgia Variations, there are multiple paths where you will end up, a pogrom will happen. and that kind of prompts you to immigrate to the United States. And so there are definitely things in Geffen's own personal story that found expression in this game. And that was something I hadn't realized before I came down here and started to learn more about their family history. Anyway, the Georgia Variations is a bigger game than the other ones. It takes 4 floppy disks. And even though it takes 4 floppy disks, it's not like interactive fiction. There is a finite number of things you can do in the game. And in fact, I mapped them all out. And there's basically like 3 main branches. And it is possible to play every scenario that you can do in this game can be mapped out like this. But Kirschen was very proud of this game. And he did a number of interviews in Israel about it. And he promoted it as, kind of a revolutionary game. Now, he had a tendency to be very hyperbolic about anything he was working on, and I don't think he was really familiar with other games of a similar genre that were being made at that time. But he described this game as a rolly. And the game itself, at the end, it says, "You've just played a rolly" by Yaakov Kirschen. And he described rolly, the term rolly, in 2 different ways. ROLI, which he said was short for robotic literature. And then ROLIE, rolly, it's a story that you have a role in. And anyhow, he was really proud of this, but it didn't really go anywhere. So these games were shown at multiple conventions in Georgia. Well, there was the one in Georgia, there was one in San Antonio. But as far as I can tell, they were never sold in any numbers at all. And
were they offered for sale at those? Were they offered for sale?
I don't believe they were. Okay. I think they were shown as demos to play, but not to buy. Now, I'm not positive about that. What I do know for certain is that years later, the Carolina Jewish Education Agency obtained the rights to these games from Kirschen, and they kind of distributed them at cost. But by 1987, these games were really looking long in the tooth. So I don't think very many copies made it around the country. I know that some did, but not very many. The only copies that I know of that I've been able to find are the ones Kirschen sent me himself, and there is 1 disc held in the Breman Museum, which I imaged on Tuesday. But other than that, these games don't exist anywhere else. But now they're on the Internet Archive, so you can play them. So after his experience with Gesher, now Kirschen understood what it took to make a game, and he decided to make some on his own. And he decided that he was going to try to approach the Learning Company. So on one of his trips to the United States, he actually cold called the Learning Company, and he says that he got them to give him upfront money to develop an educational game. This was going to be a secular educational game, and it ended up being called You and Doc Possum. And like I said earlier, he made this game with Danny Weisberg, the teenager who did Raster Master. And this is actually a pretty polished educational game. The idea here is that you're a field mouse and you're investigating nature mysteries. You have to go to these different habitats and see what's going on and solve the case. And when you solve the case, you get this really fun final dance routine thing where the field mouse starts dancing and you can push some keys on the keyboard and kind of change the way that she's dancing. It's a fun game, and I mean it's still a little rough around the edges, but it's very polished.
Didn't the Learning Company end up buying MECC?
I'm not positive about that. I think that sounds right, but I'm not sure.
I know they've been acquired by somebody with a generic sounding name.
The thing that I have not been able to understand or figure out is if they paid upfront money for this game, why they never released it. This was totally a releasable game, and I don't know if it just wasn't up to their standards or what the deal was. But it never saw a release. There are 3 versions of the game that I recovered. One has no branding, one has Learning Company branding, and the final one has Antic branding. And you might say, Antic branding? That's an Apple II game. Well, Antic Publishing briefly had an Apple II magazine called II Computing, and I think it started like in 86 or 87. Again, kind of late for oldish Apple II games like this. But Kirschen had a connection to some folks in Antic, which we'll see in just a minute, from his work when he worked with them on Atari stuff. And so when they started this magazine, like in 86, 87, they said, "Do you have anything?" And he gave them this game, and they sold You and Doc Possum apparently in their catalog. Whether anyone bought it, I doubt. No, this is literally the only reference to this game anywhere in any archive or in the internet, anywhere on the internet that I've been able to find, is this single ad. But like I said earlier, yes, you can play the games. They're on the Internet Archive. Search for Yaakov Kirschen and you'll find them. And it's all the Apple II stuff pretty much works, with the one caveat that because the Georgia Variations is a multi-disc game, you can only play the first disc because the Internet Archive's web-based emulation only doesn't support disc swapping. So if you want to play it in full, you're better off downloading the disc image and putting it in an emulator, or putting it on your own floppy disk and playing it on the real thing. If I believe they're here. If they're not, they're definitely on my website. Okay, so I'm gonna try to hustle through these. Thank you for letting me crash your meeting, by the way. Artificial personality. So this, as you probably know, Jack Tramiel bought Atari in 1984. He was a Holocaust survivor from Poland and was familiar with Kirshen's cartoon, Dry Bones. And so, hard as it might be to believe, absent those facts, Kirschen and Tramiel struck up a relationship. They actually did socialize a little bit together with their wives at this time. And here you can see a note card that I got from Kirschen earlier this year that had Tramiel's personal phone numbers and his office phone numbers, just kind of showing their relationship. And so what Kirschen did was, after Tramiel bought Atari, he basically pitched Tramiel on, let's work together. And what they came up with was that Kirschen would develop an Atari ST-powered kiosk for making greeting cards. So the idea was, you go into Walgreens, there'd be this kiosk there, and it would easily guide you through the process of making greeting cards customized just for you or for whoever you were going to give it to. It was a really good idea. And so Tramiel helped Kirschen get funding. He had his bank give him like a line of credit, and then Kirschen also secured some financing from something called the Bird Foundation. And using that money, he hired some student programmers. This is Yoram Bieberman in this picture, and that's one of the very first Atari ST computers. So Kirschen says he had one of the first like dozen or 20 off the line. And if you're familiar with the Atari ST, you've probably heard about how the original 520s had problems with the chips becoming unseated, and Atari's literal prescription. Kirschen told me this story unprompted. He said we would call them up and say, hey, it's broken, and they'd say, lift it up and drop it to reseat the chips. And I had heard that story in the past, and I wondered if it was apocryphal, but actually Kirschen confirmed that's really what they told us to do. So he had one of the very first STs. And one of the big things about this software was it was going to have an artificial personality. And Kirschen, as an artist, felt that computers were way too inhuman, too unfriendly, hard to use, all this command line stuff. But even with the mouse, it still wasn't friendly enough. So he wanted to make a character that you would interact with on the screen to guide you through the process of making the greeting card. And basically, this is literally the main character of his comic strip, Dry Bones. In Dry Bones, he's called Schuldig, but in this context, he called him Murray because it was intended for a wide American audience. But it's the same character, same design. This is Kirschen and his wife, Sally. So there's a whole lot more to this story, and I don't want to take up your time, and I can't tell you all of it. But basically what happened is the greeting card project did not work out. They did develop it. They were working with some greeting card companies and also some pinball companies trying to make this kiosk happen, but there were problems with the printing technology, and it just didn't materialize. But what did happen was that they spun off these characters, these artificial personalities, into their own thing. And so Antic and Atari, Atari wanted to show some software at the London Computer Show in late 1985, and they didn't have very much to show. And so they asked, can we show this character but not talk about the greeting card part? And that's where Antic first saw the Murray character. And it was like a chat situation where you would interact with it and have a conversation. And they thought, hey, we could sell this. Antic was trying to create a catalog which they were going to use with the launch of the Atari. And they wanted to kind of pre-populate it with software that people could buy once they got their Ataris. And so Mom and me and Murray and me were among the very first software that you could buy for the Atari ST, and they were in the cover of the very first Antic catalog. And Antic supported it with full-color ads in several issues, and it did actually sell, but not a lot. By my calculations, it was probably fewer than 2,000 sold. And as I said before, you had asked me how I got into it. This is how I got into it, because I had a copy of both Mom and Murray, pirated copies, that I inherited from my uncle, who was an Atari ST user, and handed his computer down to us when we were kids in the early 90s. And so I remembered it from my youth, and like 10 years ago, I was wanting to make a Mother's Day themed blog post, and I thought, oh, Mom and Me, I remember that program. That would be a great post. Went looking for it, nowhere to be found. It was nowhere. It had never been pirated, never been archived. And so anyway, an odyssey ensued, which I'll skip over, but that's how I got into it. Lastly, artificial creativity. So told you about artificial personalities. Another one of Kirshen's big ideas was artificial creativity. He had this idea that let's make these computers compose music by themselves. And let me kind of get you into this by playing a clip from the end credits of a BBC TV documentary called The Demjanjuk Dossier, which aired in 1988. So this is just a short, like 1-minute clip. Is it loud enough? And there's the music credit, Y. Kirschen and JYF Music Generator.
Takes me back to the old movie days when the credits always rolled.
Yes.
You looked to see who was on there.
Yes. So that was the kind of music that was sort of possible with this, although there was some finessing, I think. But what was this stuff? Where did it come from? The music you heard was composed by a computer, not a human, and it was called, Kirschen called it his Jiffy Box, JFY, and that's from Just For You. So that was his American company, Just For You, Inc., and the name came from his idea that you could create apparently infinite variety by just having a set number of different fit-together parts that you rearrange. And so that was going to be the idea behind the greeting cards, that you'd have a whole lot of kind of like pre-composed stuff that could be remixed to make something that seemed to be different from what you did the last time. This music was the same deal. He hired a big team of student programmers, and some of them were tasked with kind of extracting what they called the musical DNA from kind of songs and compositions, classical works. So they were extracting three things: rhythm, melody, and chords. And they kind of built a database of all these different pieces. And then the software would kind of dynamically combine them differently to make new songs. And the original intention was to kind of make like a never-ending jukebox. So you get a themed disc, like a pop disc, a Beatles kind of disc. You'd put it in your Commodore Amiga, and it would play apparently endless new music. This is a screenshot from the Baroque version of Magic Harp. And according to Kirschen, he had an arrangement directly with Irving Gould that they were going to package these discs with Amigos. They were going to be bundled with Amigas. I don't have any documentary evidence to support that yet. I have plenty of documentary evidence about the Atari business relationship, but I haven't yet found any documentation about what exactly they had arranged with Commodore. But according to their business plan and according to their recollections, they were working directly with Irving Gould. And so that was the idea, that these would be bundled and they would also be sold separately.
We need the connection. There's a guy who's done a huge amount of work, all the Atari, all the Amiga, and all the Commodore research up in Canada. He's produced like 5 books.
Oh, I think I know who you're talking about. Yes.
You would know about this if anyone happened.
Yeah, I'm going to reach out. This is, they got far enough that they did finish the Beatles version and they finished the Baroque version. Unfortunately, Commodore was at that time in 86, 87 was making big changes, which I'm sure all you guys are familiar with. And so they ended up killing the original Amiga, making 2 new Amigas, and there wasn't a place for this kind of software with either one of them. They didn't want to bundle it with the business version, and they didn't want to bundle any software at all with the entertainment one. That was what Kirschen said anyhow. And so they had to pivot because without that bundling, they needed some other source of revenue, and that's when they pivoted to kind of selling this to producers as a possible turnkey solution for making music for your productions, kind of a cheaper way to make background music. And so just like with Murray and with Mom, which had been profiled in the New York Times and other newspapers, Kirschen got some big coverage of this technology as well. So this is the Los Angeles Times, the Associated Press wrote about it, and as you saw, it was used in an actual documentary for the BBC. Despite all of that, and despite traveling the United States and showing it to everyone he could, he didn't find any takers, and he just couldn't sell it. And so what they ultimately ended up doing was making a deal with a guy who had a business of importing cheap MIDI interfaces. So he would get these MIDI interfaces cheap, and then he wanted to bundle software with it. And so he purchased the IBM version of this technology, which was called the Music Creator, and sold it as a bundle. Didn't sell very well. But I did find evidence on Usenet that at least a couple of people had purchased it, so it did make it to a few people in the wild, but didn't really take off. And so Kirschen was basically in terrible financial straits. They had gotten loans, they had gotten grant money, but nothing that they ever developed made any significant money. And so they tried to use bankruptcy to protect themselves, but in Israel, the bank just transferred the debt to them personally. And so Kirschen joked, "We even failed at bankruptcy. We failed at everything else, and we failed at bankruptcy too." So that's kind of the sad ending, and there it would have stopped, and the software would have been forgotten and lost. I guess if not somebody like me getting interested in it and doing the legwork to recover it and to learn the history of it. So there you have it. That's the software, and that's some of the history. My intention is I've published kind of summary histories of all the different pieces. There's a lot more detail and a lot of interesting side things with this, some of which I published on my blog. Now I'm beginning to write long form, and it may become a book. It may be maybe like more of a Patreon series or something. I'm not 100% sure on the form, but I am doing the writing now to do like a long form, really deep dive into the people who made this software and why it didn't work. And so anyhow, that's my presentation. If you got any questions, love to answer them. And that's my info.
You said you've met and spoken with the man. Do you know if he is kind of aware at all of what's going on with generative AI and AI art? It sounds like he kind of wrote the baby version of that one.
Yes. So I know that he is aware of it to some extent. He has. Okay. Let me back up. One thing I didn't put in the presentation, he tried to patent the music technology. He actually got as far as making the application, but he ran out of money. They needed to further refine it because the first round of review found different problems, and he didn't have any money to pursue it anymore. So he basically abandoned the patent application. But he did later get a different.
Very likely.
And so these techniques are not exactly the same thing as generative AI, but it was the same idea, decades ahead of time. And they were trying to do the same thing. Hey, you don't have to create anything anymore. The computer will do it for you. So it was definitely the same idea.
Did he get out of debt?
He did eventually. So they still kind of struggle. Both he and his wife, they're artists. Something I didn't realize until very recently was that the Jerusalem Post went into severe financial difficulties at the end of the 80s. And so he stopped doing the cartoon for them and did it for other outlets. They kind of made ends meet by using their Commodores and doing like TV titles and they would create graphics and stuff on the Amiga and sell it to producers and things like that. So they scratched it out eventually, but he was just an idea guy, and he was constantly going from one project to the next, and they overlapped. There's other things I didn't get into here. There's some things that he's told me about and that I've read about. Like when Thomas Friedman interviewed him for the New York Times, he told him about this program called computology. And it was a simulation where the user is God, and there's a whole bunch of dynamically created, characters in the computer who are worshiping you. And it was just kind of this thought experiment that he did on the Apple II. But there was an MIT professor who was really fascinated by it. And that's one that is lost to history. And I would love to know more about what that was, what kind of interest the MIT professor had. Because this was a professor who was working in artificial intelligence and stuff. So he had all these crazy ideas, some of which they really put money and effort into, not all of which succeeded. But
Well, thank you for coming.
thank you for having me. Thank you for letting me crash your meeting.